Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Otamanova and I'm happy to see you in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum today. It's day 444, the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor, and all this time the aggressor keeps committing the war crimes against our population, including civil population, and today we will be talking about the crimes committed by Russians against our Ukrainian children. We will have the presentation of the information by Save Ukraine, who will demonstrate the evidences of Russia's crimes against the Ukrainian children. So our guests today are Mykola Kuleba, founder of Save Ukraine, Commissioner of the President of Ukraine for Children's Rights in 2014-2021. Joining us in this studio is Alina Kovaleva, a girl that we managed to return after one of the missions of Save Ukraine, Svitlana Popova, Alina's mother, who was deported to Russia, and Myroslava Kharchenko, a lawyer at Save Ukraine, and Kateryna Rashevska, legal expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights. Good afternoon, dear friends. Ms. Mykola, please tell us what happened. We know it's been your sixth mission to rescue the Ukrainian children from the occupiers' territories. How have you managed to do this? Good afternoon, everybody. The goal of today's press conference is to represent the undeniable evidences of the crimes of the aggressor, I mean Ukraine, against Ukrainian children, which represent a crime of genocide. So we got those evidences after our 6 missions. Now the 7th rescue mission is being prepared, and we managed to return 96 Ukrainian children from Russian imprisonment. I want to start with a couple of ways. The methods. It's being asked very frequently by the journalists. How do the children end up kidnapped? How is the deportation happening? So we will talk about those methods. How do children end up as hostages and prisoners in the enemy's territory? Just in case if I talk too fast, please stop me so I explain everything. So the first method is manipulations, threats, and intimidation. The occupiers deport children or people to Crimea or Belarus under the premises of rest and recreation. Why do we call it deportation or kidnapping? Because in the occupied territories, sometimes people end up in isolation without mobile communication, access to internet, and the only information they're getting is the information they get from the occupiers. This is the information that those lands, again, I'm conveying the words of the parents and of the kids that we rescue on a daily basis, those whom we evacuate from the areas of battle operations and from temporarily occupied territories. So they are being told that those lands will never get back to Ukraine, and if they want to survive, they want to strictly follow the occupiers' instructions, and any insolence will be violently oppressed. Also, there are threats regarding the deprivation of parenting rights and removal of children in case of incompliance, taking them away from the families. At the same time, there are violent executions, demonstrative violent executions of those who resist. Sometimes they are being shot to death or sometimes deported. According to our information, they are being deported to the so-called camps. First, it was the children of the collaborationists who were going on to those camps. It was happening during occupation, and the occupational government, in our opinion, was checking the occupiers for their readiness to cooperate, to check their readiness to comply with the orders. After those children, the collaborationist children, were back from the camps, their example was used to encourage other people to have a taken to those camps, and the main purpose of those camps was to create the new image of Russia, to have them adhere to Russia as a country who will take better care of them than Ukraine. This demonstrates the Russian strategy on assimilation and Russification of those children. And as the example, children from Kharkiv region who were deported to Anapa, whom we returned afterwards, those children were issued new telephones. They told us that they were getting Russian SIM cards for their phones, they were bought new footwear and clothing, they were taken to the zoo and entertained in a number of ways. The Russians try to demonstrate that they are ready to treat them properly, to treat them normally. After the territories got occupied, the children became hostages in the territory of the enemy, and they've taken the conscious resolution not to return them to their families. And all the children that we returned, including Alina and the rest of them, we found no single case when someone on Russian part was trying to find their parents or relatives. No single case. Regardless the fact that Russian side communicates or states that they were taking effort to find the parents or relatives and to return the children to their families. So all the evidences we got from the parents and the children, they show that children were not even attempted to be returned to their families. Meanwhile, the parents were trying to contact the management of the camps, and the employees were trying to avoid the conversations with the parents, and children were told that they will not be brought back to Ukraine, that their parents refused them, and they will be adopted by Russian foster homes or Russian families, and they were offered a Russian citizenship, which is a demonstrative evidence that the main purpose, the main goal of Russia was to keep those children in Russia. The places where the children are brought to, they are left with no accompaniment of their parents or foster parents. So in compliance with the Russian legislation, those bodies may at their discretion result where children were staying for a long enough period without their parents to be assigned the status of an orphanage, which then would allow them to be adopted by the families of Russian citizens. On top of that, staying for a long time in Russia, among Russian propagandists, children are more susceptible to anti-Ukrainian narratives. In children camps in Russia and in Crimea, the people were forced to study Russian history, language, literature, and children undergo the intensified de-Ukrainization training course to brainwash them and to eradicate their Ukrainian identity. So when we will be talking about Alina's case, what was interesting to me is when Alina was attending Russian school, she was just put at the first desk, she was given the Russian texts, and she had to rewrite them from the textbook in Russian language on a daily basis. Another method, the second method of kidnapping of Ukrainian children is the forced deportation, which Russians call the rescue and evacuation of Ukrainian children. So Russian occupiers in a forced manner move civil population to temporarily occupied territories or to the territory of Russian Federation. They consciously create conditions which are not fit for living in the occupied territories. There is intimidation, arrests, lack of medical assistance, power shutdowns, absence of water supply, heat supply, absence of opportunity to live to the territory under Ukrainian government control. Thus, the conditions are created when the only way of rescue is the so-called evacuation to Russian Federation or other temporarily occupied territories. What is happening within the last weeks in the occupied territories of Zaporizhia region and other regions is when the Russians, they bring the buses And for example, last week, from Berdansk, there were 660 children deported, and from other settlements. So Russians just deport them to different regions of Russian Federation. Well, you know, I'm telling this to you right now. So, and it came up to my mind a case of a 12-year-old boy whom we returned to Ukraine from a camp where he was deported and he was staying there for half a year. So I asked him, wasn't he afraid to stay in Russia forever? So imagine, 12-year-old boy, he said, no, I was never afraid of that. And I asked him, did you believe that someone will pick you up from here? He said, no, I knew I will flee. I was planning to run away. I just didn't have a strict plan how to cross the minefields in the forward edge of the battle area. So a 20-year-old boy was telling me about dreaming of coming back to Ukraine, planning his runaway. The only thing he was not conscious of, but something that he was preparing to cross the minefields in the forward edge of the battle area. I was really impressed by that story. This boy is now in one of our centers of hope and recovery, undergoing rehabilitation with his mother. So let's proceed to the third method. It's what all the world has seen when Maria Lvova Belova, Putin's commissioner for children's rights, was deporting children from Mariupol, including 31 orphans, and the rest of the kids were children from the families whose parents were missing in action or killed in Mariupol. So those children were deported to Russia, to different regions of Russia. I think everybody has seen that footage when the children were brought to Russia with planes. They were using even the planes full of children. So she took one of those children with her, adopted him, and then those children were also adopted by Russian families and given Russian citizenship. So again, the parents who were imprisoned or were in the filtration camps or ended up in hospitals or died, as I mentioned again, missing in action. So the occupiers assigned those children the status of children who arrived to Russian Federation without legal representative. So in compliance with the documents that we received, this is what happens. And then those children are being forwarded to Russian families or the orphanages. So this is the relevant status according to the Russian legislation that they assign to these children. And we will be getting back to Alina's story again. So the fourth method is the deportation of children who were educated in orphanages or foster homes. They are not, in fact, orphans because they have biological parents, those children. Children used to have a director appointed by the Ukrainian government who was their legal representative. The occupiers, they appoint their directors out of the collaborationists who undertake illegal resolutions as to recreation or medical treatment of the children or non-treatment. Their movement without their legal representatives, so the decisions are taken on assignment of Russian citizenship to those children upon the illegal applications of those illegal representatives. So this is how the Ukrainian children can become, so to say, citizens of Russian Federation. So one of the children who got back from that foster home, they had a mother who was a hostage for half a year. This child had biological mother, but this child is seriously ill, and their health was even more deteriorated, and after their return to Ukraine, they had to undergo treatment at psychiatric facility because the relevant medical assistance was not provided for them. Now I want to proceed to Alina's story. Alina, who was kidnapped from the occupied territory, first intimidated. We know this story in detail, but maybe Alina and her mother will tell you something, and we may have something to add. Alina, please, the floor is yours. She's really worried, but we are here for you. Please tell us a little bit how you ended up there, what was happening. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alina. I'm 15 years old. I live in Myroslava district of Kherson region. We had Kharchenko Zhenya living in our settlement. She was my friend. I was coming to her place, and then she told me once there will be Ukrainians coming for us to kill us. And then I stole the certificate at home and I left to Russia with her. Yeah. So tell us how it was happening. How did you manage to leave? Back then there were battles going on around. Everything was very close. Well, the Russians stole a car from my teacher and we left to Kakhovka on that car. So who was driving? It was a Russian. A military, yeah, right. A Russian military. Then we came to Kakhovka. We spent the night there and then we went to Krasnodar. What was the transport you were using? It was the military transport, a military truck, an Ural, so you were accompanied by the military. Well, we were accompanied by the other Russians on the way to Russia. Then from Kakhovka we went to Krasnodar. So how did you go there? We were going on buses, on trains. Then from Krasnodar we went to Jigba, spent a couple of weeks there, and then we were brought to Mordovia, to Kolikino, and over there. So you ended up in Mordovia. Yeah, right. And then what was going on there? So we were put in a Caspi hotel. We spent a little bit of time there, and then we got a certificate for home, and then we moved to that home, and we lived there. And what about the study? Well, we were attending school and we were tasked just to write the texts in Russian from the book. So have you been living in this house only two of you? No, with other kids, with their kids. My name is Svitlana, I'm Alina's mother. She was living there with that Zhenya, who's taken her away from our village. She became a collaborationist and she brought her to Russia. So it was her mother, her sister, her nephew, all of them left and they took Alina with them. So they all left to Russia. Over there she was studying. She was living with that Zhenya. She was nursing her children, and this is how she was spending her time there. So she was circumvented by that Zhenya. She instigated her. She said that the Ukrainian soldiers will come back to Kherson and they will kill everybody who was taking humanitarian aid from Russians or who was communicating with Russians. I told her, like, look, daughter, we're not pro-Russian. No one is gonna do harm to us. Well, everybody was taking humanitarian aid from Russian soldiers. All the kids, they were just running around as regular kids. But she did not believe me. She trusted Zhenya more. She was trusting Russian soldiers. So she stole that certificate and she ran away. But then she was crying like, Mom, I didn't really want it. Please take me back home. But I did not know where she was. I knew with whom she was, but I never knew where she was in Russia. But once we found Zhenya in Facebook, so we found her contacts, her Russian phone number, and this is how we started communicating with her through Viber Messenger. And I was telling her, like, daughter, I will come there to pick you up. And she said, like, maybe you don't come to pick me up because it's a one-way ticket. This is what they say. They're not going to let you out. And I said, it doesn't matter for me. I will come for you anyway. And then I found this organization, Save Ukraine, and they supported me. They helped me to find my daughter and take her back from Russia. Well, it was quite a complicated way. All those checkpoints, borders, everything is very difficult, both physically and morally. But I took this effort. I came there, and I've taken my daughter back, and now we're back in Ukraine. So that's it. If you have any questions, please, I'm ready to answer all of them. Well, we will proceed to the questions maybe later, but look, all the stories, I will pass the mic to Save Ukraine lawyer. She will talk more about the legal aspects of our activities. But what we're hearing all the time is when children say that in occupied territories they're being intimidated, they're being manipulated, they're being told they will be raped, they will be killed. And it's a not single story when children just flee and then they're being picked up by the military. Just like in Alina's case, the military took a car full of people, full of women, and then they were brought to Russia on a military truck. And the program works in Russia quite strictly. They are being dispersed across the regions to some villages in Mordovia. They are being given a house. They are being made all kinds of aid payments. They are being put to Russian schools, but at the same time no one is looking for the parents of those children. No one asks them where their parents are. The parents are not being searched for, but imagine the copy of her Ukrainian certificate, it was reinstated in Crimea. In Crimea she was issued, or in Kakhovka, in occupied territory of Kakhovka, she was issued the copy of Russian certificate, and then in Russia she is getting a Russian certificate of birth. And if it's not for us to pick her up, she was taking her fingerprints already, and she was about to get the Russian passport. So everything works on Russification of the children, to have the documents issued to them. And in the same village there are more Ukrainian kids and the families, and they attend schools there. And we can say that it's a system in Russian Federation, the system for Russification of Ukrainian children and eradication of Ukrainian identity. So Myroslava, let's talk about the legal aspects Good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Mykola has already told everything for me, but still I will show you something. It's a little bit inconvenient with the microphone. So Alina brought all that paperwork with her. Thank you very much, Svetlana. So reviewing those documents, I was a little bit shocked because everything is being produced so quickly, as if everybody knew that Alina is about to come, and everything was ready to hand the documents to her. So this is how she reinstated a copy of Ukrainian certificate of birth in Novakhovka County. This is the certificate that says that the only document that Alina had on her was a copy of her birth certificate of Ukrainian standard. Then we see the resolution as of November 22, year 2022. It's not yet on the screen, so it's a Russian decree on temporary fostering of Alina. It's the fostering that Lvova Belova keeps talking about when she is being accused of illegal guardianship over our Ukrainian children, illegal fostering of Ukrainian children by a third person, for which Lvova Belova says is something that you are lost in translation, you haven't understand it correctly, is the preliminary guardianship to just settle some bureaucratic moments. But based on this decree, based on this temporary guardianship, this collaborationist, this woman, she got the child put in school on the very same date, which means that everybody knew everything back then, and they were preparing for that. And we see all the documents from the school, so everything was ready, everything was prepared. Afterwards, on the 5th of November, Alina was added to the system of individual accounting. Is the special register in the Russian Federation where all of the recipients of social payments and insurance contributions, all the Russian citizens, persons without citizenship, and the foreigners, they are all on this register. And she was just another Ukrainian to show up on that register. A little bit later, in December, she was forced to give her fingerprints. Is the evidence that she was on the way to receive the Russian citizenship, is the evidence that she was not supposed to just study there, is the evidence that this foster family was not only about to receive payments for her fostering, but she was about to get Russian citizenship, because this procedure of fingerprinting is mandatory before you acquire Russian citizenship. So finally we see a Russian standard certificate of birth issued to Ukrainian child in Crimea. For me as a lawyer, that's all absurd. This is not something that happens in a normal country. No law can allow it. Or not even the laws, but customs, because what's going on in Russia, it's illegal. There is no legislation for this. This is only traditions and customs. So what our organization made, we made it on time, because in Russia they get passports at 14 years old. You could carry Russian passports, so they were postponing it, but we were able to save her, to rescue her. But again, getting back to Maria Lvova Belova, she keeps saying that the parents were giving their children away for recreation and rest from Kharkiv and Kherson region absolutely voluntarily. They have a consent in the package of documents of every child. She waves this package of paperwork around, which says that the children happily got on a bus and went on to that recreation camp. Mr. Mykola already named the cases this consent was acquired in which circumstances that consent was acquired. We were seeing the condition of the parents, we've seen the condition of the children. They were told how they were captured, how the Russians came and how they bombed all the infrastructure, how as they had nothing to eat, that Russians could enter any home and pull any person out of the home at their bread, whether children or adults, whoever. So they knew what the Russian military are capable of. And obviously, when a collaboration is accompanied by a Russian military comes to your home and opens the door with the food, you understand that you probably may not find enough strength to refuse. But talking about the legitimacy of this consent, we have to emphasize that such consent was given for 2 weeks, and the consent was given to have a child brought to a specific camp in a specific place. On top of that, the consent was to have a child accompanied by an adult. So none of those parameters was adhered to. So the legitimacy of this consent, which Maria Lvova Belova keeps reiterating about, is void. All this process has nothing to do with the laws, with the legality. So please spread this information about our organization. If you know about the children or your children end up in Russia, if they stuck there, we will try to help you. Well, you know, Myroslava was talking, and yesterday's story came up to my mind. We have a boy living in our center, 6 years old, so he's stuttering, and he has problems with sleeping. He wakes up multiple times during the night. So he's from Kherson region, and he was living in the occupied territories with both of his parents. After the territories were occupied, Russian military came to his home. They put a barrel of a gun to his mother's head. They took his father as prisoner. Thanks God he was not killed, but when father got back, he was in such a condition, he was looking so bad that the child is stuttering, and the child is having very serious problems in terms of his health. So this is about the voluntary consent. They want people to agree. So this is what they call voluntary consent, and they intimidate the families. They threaten them with having them deprived of their parenting rights. And then another story, the story of Vlada Pavlyuk. I was outraged by that story. It happened on the 7th of October. A child was deported to temporarily occupied territory. For 7 months she was staying in the Camp Luchisti in Crimea. First, her foster grandmother Olga Bogdanivna, as a part of our 5th rescue mission, she was on the way to pick up her grandchild, and we already told that story. So after 14 hours of interrogation by FSB, interrogation of that group, the grandmother was out of the bus. She stepped out of the bus on the bus stop and fell dead there right away. We have evidences of her death. We had to cremate her in Russia and to bring her ashes back to Ukraine. And all that time we were in communication, in contact with the girl. We have a lawyer, Kateryna, who was responsible for daily communication with Vlada. And being in contact, the girl was waiting for her grandmother. It was her desire to come back to Ukraine the soonest possible. And after the death of her grandmother, the child was in despair. And when we were picking up the children, we were not able to pick up Vlada because there was no legal representative. But Vlada did want to come back after the first days after the death of her grandmother, but the communication between Kateryna and Vlada, it demonstrated that Vlada wants to come back to Ukraine less and less. And she said that the head of this camp, the director of this camp, a former Berkut serviceman who switched sides after 2014. So in that camp, his name was Astakhov. He was torturing the kids in that camp. He was putting them in isolator. He was mocking Ukraine, humiliating kids, physically punishing them. They were locked in isolators, in isolation rooms. So those are the evidences we got from the children. So that Astakhov, he started carrying Vlada somewhere, buying her new clothes. And as per the words of Vlada and other kids, Vlada was promised to be adopted. And again, we have these evidences of those promises. So Astakhov was telling her that in Ukraine only bad things are prepared for her, that she would be put in a foster home, but in reality there is an aunt in Ukraine, there is a brother and the sister. She has a place to come back to, and there are people whom she can come back to. And then afterwards, during our 6th mission, we registered the legal representation, and that person arrived to the management of the camp, but the directors of the camp refused to return the child, and they didn't provide any opportunity to get in contact with Vlada. And in a few hours before the arrival of the legal representative, Vlada was carried away in unknown direction. Now it's been 3 weeks that we have no information about that child. We don't know about the conditions she lives in, who takes care of her, whether she is safe and secure at all. Probably she is under some serious pressure now, but the fact that she is a hostage of this situation is obvious. But what we know is that she was brainwashed. She was psychologically processed from the very beginning of our communication. At the same time, Myroslava Belova stated multiple times that Russian authorities assist to return of Ukrainian kids back to Ukraine. So this is the example of the distorted truth the Russian Federation tries to present to the world. So our request is to find out the whereabouts of Vlada. All of our requests was ignored by both the local governments and the management of the camps, and we hope that thanks to the publicity of this story, coverage of this case, thanks to your efforts, Russia will stop, and at least they will communicate us the whereabouts of that child, so we can bring her back to Ukraine. We emphasize that we will continue fighting to bring Vlada back home. Myroslava, do you have anything to add about Vlada's case? Well, I can tell how they were preparing. I would like to mention that deportation of Ukrainian children is something that Russian Federation started back in 2014 when Donetsk and Luhansk regions were occupied along with Crimea. Within those 8 years, they were dealing with two things. They were honing their Russification skills, so they remade all the textbooks. They prepared everything to break everything Ukrainian in our kids who remained in those territories. They were setting up different cadet corps, youth army. So those were measures taken at militarization of the kids. Now all those kids are were militarized, Russified, and they are in the ranks of those who fight against Ukraine now. So another thing Russia was doing, they were preparing on the legislative level to legalize, so to say, according to the Russian legislation, to legalize the deportation of Ukrainian children. They started doing it back in 2018. Now they are very active in using of an article of a Russian law on guardianship and fostering. They implemented that article back in 2013, and now they make a lot of use of it. In 2018, they started changing the law on citizenship, on Russian citizenship, and obviously they started from the key thing. They added more rights to Putin. They gave him the right to specifically and unilaterally being guided by his opinion or whatever he has inside of his head to identify the categories of foreigners who are entitled to simplified procedure of acquisition of Russian citizenship. One of the main premises for simplified citizenship, then it's enough to be just Ukrainian. And the third format that contemplated the simplified procedure is recognition of a person as the Russian language speaker. There was a special commission established in that case, and when the people from Kherson and Zaporizhia regions were coming there, they could undergo that exam without previous interview. So it was a formal procedure that even I could pass, probably, to tell something in Russian, to write some text, and here I go, I'm a Russian language speaker and I'm a citizen of Ukraine. Oh, I apologize, citizen of Russia, obviously. So again, getting back to this article on temporary guardianship, in accordance to which this temporary guardianship was established over Alina and other kids who stayed there. So Maria Lvova stated that it's a document that gives nothing. However, the right to become the temporary guardianship is vested in like everybody. So if you want to become a full-fledged guardian, you have to undergo some inspection with the law enforcement agencies, psychological examination, and so on and so forth. So for the temporary guardianship, when the person is appointed a guardian over some minors, they should not undergo that procedure. The law enforcement can just see that person and identify whether they can be a legal representative of a Ukrainian kid. Also, this law stipulates that there is the temporary guardian, they have the same rights with the permanent guardian. More amendments that were made to Russian legislation in years 22-23, they entitled those temporary guardians to address for simplified procedure to enter into Russian citizenship. So everything is very well traced in this Russian legislation. They set it forth very accurately and cautiously. And back in 2022, Putin adopted those legal acts that we know about, which state directly that orphans from LPR, DPR, and just other citizens of Ukrainian children, they are entitled to the simplified procedure for entering Russian citizenship. So if we analyze all those documents, it turns out that any person, a collaborationist, can come to my child in school, they can take them away to those occupied territories to get some documents for my kids, for like if anybody confirms their identity. and those documents can be obtained anywhere, and they can they can set up a guardianship. They can submit an application then for the child to enter the Russian citizenship, and a child then becomes a Russian citizen. This is how the Russian legislation works. They were preparing for this, and we can trace it quite clearly. This all of those amendments are aimed at Russification of Ukrainian kids. As to the payments that they get for Ukrainian children in Russia, there is the resolution of their government dated 18th February, I apologize, 17th February 2022, just a couple of days before the war. Back then they already contemplated those disbursements for the citizens of Ukraine who were forced to flee Ukraine to move to Russia. So 6 days before the war, the payments for Ukrainian kids were already contemplated by Russian legislation. Ms. Kateryna, please join our conversation. I'm sure you have something to add. Well, obviously, before I voice my recommendations to the foreign governments and the members of international community, I would like to add a little bit to what Ms. Myroslava and Mr. Mykola said. First, I would like to put accents as to the consent. One of the accents is the manipulation by the Russian Federation, including by Maria Lvova Belova, that the consent by the competent authorities of Ukraine will be considered as collaborationist activity. So as of today, there is no single criminal case based on the fact of collaborationist activities due to such consent. So that's yet another fake produced by Russian Federation to make sure that those parents stay in Russian Federation and to make it impossible for them to come back to Ukraine. This is yet another method of manipulation and intimidation of the vulnerable category of citizens of Ukraine. Besides, the obligation to repatriate Ukrainian kids is vested in Russian Federation just until the very moment that the last Ukrainian kid crosses the border of our state. This is corroborated by the Moscow mechanism expert, and if the territory is deoccupied, it's Russian Federation who needs to find the alternative ways. Just to say that we're not in control because there is the armed forces of Ukraine arriving is the violation of international humanitarian law, which constitutes a war crime. As to other war crimes, Mr. Mykola mentioned Zaporizhia region, so-called forced evacuation, because the occupiers themselves, they cannot understand what is the nature of their actions. So we can assume that in that case Russian Federation uses our civil population, including the children, as a life shield. The life shield is yet another war crime. Russian Federation keeps committing these crimes starting from 2014. It's documented by International Criminal Court. So, availing myself of this opportunity, I want to present the recommendations for the International Criminal Court on expansion of the existing arrest warrants with regard of the lengthening of process of repatriation and the use of Ukrainian children as a life shield, and the list of the people in relation of which the arrest warrants are issued by ICC. That list is not sufficient. There are many more people to be included on those lists. So regarding our recommendations, we can divide them in a number of categories. I'm not listing all of them because they're numerous. So first of them, as to the liability, I would like our technical team to bring the recommendations to the screen. So as to the bringing the guilty ones to liability, it's very important because there is the principle of irrevocability of the legal liability, and their crimes has no terms of those crimes have no terms of expiration. The person should be persecuted until the very moment of their imprisonment or the warrant or issuance of warrant of their arrest. So we insist that all the parties of the International Criminal Court to recognize the legitimacy of the arrest warrants, and in case those people end up in their territories, including by plane, they should land those planes in their territory and hand over those persons to The Hague for justice. Also, we have to include all of the guilty persons to the sanction list. In this case, you know, the European Commission is dealing with discussion of the 11th package of sanctions, which include 23 persons which were involved in illegal deportation of Ukrainian children. We ask those persons to show up on those sanction lists, which would be effective not only in European Union but also in other countries. Another area is the return of our kids, and my colleagues agree with me, this is the most sensitive sphere for us. We don't do it for the sake of justice and to see someone behind the bars. We just want to bring back our children home. We ask all of you to support Ukraine in identification of Ukrainian kids. You see 19,393 children, their names in the portal Children of War. It's not even a half or not even a third of the number of the Ukrainian kids deported to Ukraine. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, but we have to launch one single legal mechanism to bring Ukrainian children back home. For this, we need the resolution on the level of the General Assembly of United Nations. Ukrainian children should not be discriminated comparing to other children which are in Iraq, in Syria, and in other areas of armed conflicts. There are resolutions of the General Assembly of United Nations related to those kids, but not in relation to Ukrainian kids. To be deprived of the status of victims, the children require rehabilitation and reintegrations. Those are costly processes, and as affected persons, children are entitled to fair compensation, which should be paid by Russia. In Europe, in the United States of America, there are billions in Russian assets. We have arrest warrants, so we ask to transfer those arrested assets to the trust fund of ICC and to start fairly compensating to the victims of Russian crimes. This is our recommendations in brief. You can get familiarized with them in more detail on our web resources. Dear colleagues, I'm sure you're having questions, so you have time to ask them. So meanwhile you're preparing your questions, I would like to emphasize, let's not to forget that under the occupiers' government, according to the information that we have, there are more than 1.5 million Ukrainian children in occupied territories of Ukraine and in the territories of Russian Federation. We don't have access to those children. We have no contact with them. We have no contact with their families. We don't know the exact number of the children who received Russian citizenship starting from 2014. What is the number of the children who starting from 2014 who were enlisted in the armed forces of Russian Federation? And we have no information how many children became orphans within these 9 years. So how many children ended up without the adults' accompaniments, who ended up in orphanages or foster homes, or were otherwise adopted by Russian families, or received citizenship and are now fostered by Russians. So the Ukrainian state has no information from Russia about this, which is yet another war crime. Those are Ukrainian children. And this is yet another evidence that this is a strategy which was developed by Russia and which has been implemented for a number of years in relation of Ukrainian children. We're having questions on the floor. Fact in newspaper. Miss Svitlana, can you please tell us how did it happen so that you were not able to hinder the kidnapping of your child. You were not aware of it. Well, we were quarreling. I told her you shouldn't go with that Jenna, but she never listened to me. She either had believed Jenna or what else could have happened, but I just couldn't find agreement with her. She just stole that certificate of birth and she ran away. Maybe she was so brainwashed that she was trusting more to Jenna's words rather than to mine. I was at home back then. I knew. She came back home back then. She told me like, Mom, let's leave because Ukrainians are coming to kill us. Because as a kids they were running to Russian soldiers, they were in contact with them just like kids. They were picking some sweets from them, or those soldiers, they were giving them humanitarian aid. I don't think it's a crime because they are kids. So she trusted the words of that Zhenya Kucherenko and she left with her. How many kids does Zhenya have? Well, she had 5 children and she was pregnant with the 6th one. So she was a collaborationist in the village. Yeah, she had contacts with the Russian soldiers. She was cooking for a Russian soldier. She was living with him. So she had no husband. Yeah, she had no husband. She has all the children from different men. This is her way of life. So they all fit in one car. Well, I don't know what was the car that they fit in. I know that they stole that car from a teacher, and in the night, my elder son, he saw her seated in that car with the Russian soldiers, but he didn't know that there was Alina in that car. If he only knew, he would taken her back home. Otherwise, but he said, I've just seen Zhenya leave on that car, and I told him Alina was with Zhenya. I didn't know what to do. I broke in tears, and I came to the Russian commander in the morning. I said my child was kidnapped in the night and she was deported in an unknown direction. So we came to the teacher. He said yes, 2 Russian soldiers came up to him. They've taken away his car. They never told him what they need the car for. But again, he was looking for that car all around the village. He found it in a day somewhere outside the village. It was broken. Well, it looks like they left that car in the curb and they got on that Ural truck and went to Kakhovka. But again, I don't know how they got there. I only know that they were using the teacher's car. So using internet, you were trying to find your kids. Yes, we were reposting the announcements. We contacted police. I have some of my sons here in Kyiv, so they were reposting information on the social media. They were going to police, but for half a year we were not able to find out where she was. So you had no page in the Facebook, and as soon as it popped up in the Facebook, you were able to find her. Yeah, as Zhenya's page popped up on the Facebook, my elder daughter found her, and so I told her, let's try to contact Zhenya to find Alina. So she favored the contact. She gave her phone number, the Russian phone number, to us, and this is how we found Alina's page online. And this is how we started contacting her through Viber, through Messenger. So how did Zhenya explain the situation to you? She's an adult, right? Well, yeah, well, what she said that no kids run away from a good mother. She said, I'm a bad mother, I educated my girl in a bad way. And I told her, if you were a good mother, you wouldn't have given your child to Russians. This is what I told her. If you put my daughter on a truck with Russian soldiers and you've taken her away, God knows where, why didn't you bring her to me? I want to give a small remark. So when Zhenya already found out that we are on our way to pick up Alina a couple of days before, she gave Alina away to the rehabilitation center, to an institution, so that her mother didn't come to her, didn't come to Zhenya to pick Alina from her. So Alina asked not to be given away. She asked Zhenya not to be given away to this rehabilitation center. So it's just that this Zhenya didn't want to see Svitlana, the mother of Alina. No, Zhenya didn't want to see the mother. Look, when Alina was trying to communicate with her mother, to talk with her mother on the phone, she broke Alina's phone. This Zhenya broke Alina's phone. She tried to hinder their communication, and when she realized that the mother is on the way, that Alina will be taken away, she just put Alina in that rehabilitation center. Well, she received this maternity capital, she received payments for all those children, she got those fostering aid payments, so that was her interest actually. We have more questions on the floor, please, friends.
From a Japanese TV NHK. I'd like to ask about the adopting parents, the fostering parents, and what are the motivation for Russian fostering parents to adopt Ukrainian kids, which is apparently transferred and deported from Ukrainian territory, and then if they know, for example, if they know that they are the Ukrainian kids that are transferred, deported from Ukrainian territory to Russia.
Да, дякую дуже. Ну, не дарма я приводив приклад.
Thank you very much. I gave you the example of Maria Lvova Belova for a reason. She just shown to the citizens of Russia, to Russian population, what can they do to the Ukrainian children. Here are Ukrainian children. Here are their parents who were killed, and just a year ago they were offering the Russian families to adopt Ukrainian kids. That was a resolution taken on a top level. This is why the International Criminal Court came up with the arrest warrant for Putin and Maria Lvova Belova, because from the very beginning, Russian side, they were given publicity to those war crimes, what should be done in their opinion to Ukrainian children. So from the very beginning of the war, so let's even talk about the year 2014, after Donbass and Crimea were occupied, our Ukrainian children were offered for adoption by Russian families, but it was all concealed, it was all clandestine. After that first invasion, that information was not public, you couldn't have found it anywhere. But after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, you were able to see that on their TV. You could read it in the publics online, that Russian citizens were invited to adopt. They were encouraged to adopt a Ukrainian child. Putin signed the relevant laws on simplified procedure of citizenship, simplified procedure of fostering, of guardianship. Everything was already public. It was like something that was encouraged. So this is why we're talking about the war crimes here, because the Russians, they take pride in it. They take pride in kidnapping Ukrainian children and having Russian families adopt them. And the legislation favors it. If I if I understand you correctly, Ms. Kateryna, maybe the journalists are interested in motivation, not only in this motivation of the country, of the state, but in the motivation of an individual. Why do they adopt the Ukrainian kids if they know that there will be parents coming to pick them up? So, quoting the governor of Yamal-Nenetsky Autonomous Region, Dmitro Artykhov, he said that their families were accepting Ukrainian children even without documents, even without knowing the actual condition of their family. It's the words of the governor. It's documented in his website, so he got himself documented as a part of the war crime. As to the adoption, the majority of the kids were adopted by the so-called resource families. Those are the families that already had either foster children or they adopted the children who had other biological parents. So there are channels where those families communicate, and there were messages on those channels like adopt a child from Donbass. But the lines that Maria Lvova-Belova was mentioning, so those lines were not lined somehow. So the representatives of the foster committees were calling to those families, or the representatives of the Ministry of Social Policy, they called those families and they said that is there civil obligation to take those kids, tipping off that they, in case they don't adopt Ukrainian kids, they may lose their status of fostering status over other children. So there was a case when a woman wanted to adopt a boy from Novosibirsk. She had a package of paperwork ready, but she was receiving a call and she was recommended to adopt 2 children from LPR, and now 2 children from LPR are educated by that woman, and that boy from Novosibirsk is still in a foster home. So that woman, she said she got intimidated. It was her civil obligation to adopt those 2 kids. And again, those 2 resource families, they are afraid of the pressure from the government bodies. So this boy, Sergei, from a Ukrainian family who we got back, he started getting messages from that Russian family on his phone, like, Sergei, please come back because we're gonna have problems. So this is their motivation. Money, new cars, new homes, new property, and the fear of losing foster rights to the new to more kids, and again, which results in the fear of losing money, losing payments, losing social goods. So there is a full vertical of those persons involved in this process, including Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova. Again, I would like to add another story which is maybe closer to Japan, a story of a girl who fled from her home in Kherson region, just like Alina, because she was told that it was not Ukrainian soldiers coming, but the Americans, the criminals, the Europeans who are about to rape all the female children. So she fled with another woman who instigated her, and she ended up in a foster home in Crimea. So they had a family there visiting them. The family from Ussurisk, that family already had 10 children. So Ussurisk is, if you check the map, it's near Japan. So it's the very, very east of Russia, and Japan is right nearby Ussurisk. So that family met that girl, and she said she didn't want to go to that family. So that family, they've taken other 8 children. Family from Ussurisk has taken 18 Ukrainian children who now reside near Japan, but in Russia. So that girl, she is the witness of another such crime. This is the way it happens. We have more questions, please. Sofia Kashmar-Timoshenko, good afternoon. You said Alina could have gotten Russian passports if it's not for your timely arrival. So the question is, during your work, have you come across such cases when you cannot return a Ukrainian kid because they are already citizens of Russian Federation? And for example, you know, I'm dealing with this topic for a long time, but I don't quite understand this motivation. I see it's a systemic program for children's deportation. It's a crime, but why? But I can understand why Russia kills those who don't agree with them, but then why does Russia deport the kids? They have to pay to their parents, they have to employ them. What's the motivation of the enemy to have this additional, so to say, burden on their budget, to create additional work for themselves? How do you explain it to yourself? Well, there's nothing surprising in this case. Let's go back in history. What was done by the Soviet authorities after they occupied Ukraine? How the assimilation and deportation was going on? What was done by the Nazi Germany with the Polish kids? How those children were deported and assimilated? There is the single task to eradicate Ukrainian identity, and it doesn't matter whether those kids are getting killed or they move to Russia, and it's good to Russia because it increases their population, it solves their demographic problems which exist in Russia, and they are the future military. Children are very easy to be tuned, to be brainwashed. They will start hating Ukraine after that. This is what was happening with Janitsars in the Ottoman Empire 500-600 years ago. This technology exists for thousands of years. If we dig deeper in history, the aggressor countries who were occupying more territories, they were taking children away, they were indoctrinating those children. And for example, why are Ukrainian adolescents, Ukrainian teens are being brought to Chechnya, while they're being put arms in their hands, they are being taken care of, so to say, they're being put to the camps. Well, the teens, the teenagers, they are curious, they are being encouraged to do so, and afterwards they are being enlisted by the armed forces, and those teenagers, 15, 16 years old, that we were communicating with, who ended up in the camps, this is what they were told. As soon as you turn 18, you go to war. You are about to be taken by the Russian army. So this is the motivation that we see. First of all, eradication of Ukrainian identity, and Russia is interested in clearing that territory. Look what Medinsky said, the advisor of Putin, who was responsible for the negotiation process with Ukraine. By the way, he was born in Ukraine. That Ukrainian land belongs to Russian children, is the strict ideology of Russian Empire. This is the land of Russian children. So either we make them Russian, either we brainwash those children and give them Russian citizenship, or otherwise we make this land clean of Ukrainian children. This is why they're interested in not having a lot of hundreds of thousands Ukrainian children not to live in Ukraine. Part of them are in the Russian Federation, and fraction of those kids are dispersed all around the world due to occupation. This is how those children lose Ukrainian identity. This is the strategy of Russian Federation. This strategy is built for years and years to come. Look, it's been 9 years since the occupation of the first territories in Donbass. That's quite enough to brainwash, to have them enter into Russian citizenship, to have them join Russian armed forces. So how How many Ukrainian boys are now in the ranks of Russian armed forces? Maybe dozens of thousands. So this is the strict strategy, the clear strategy of the Russian Federation. They need those children because they are the future citizens of Russian Federation. They are the future military. Well, last question maybe.
And Chris Hampson, National Security Media. Do you consider it good news that South Africa, for instance, said that they would oblige the ICC, membership, and that they essentially cautioned Putin not to come? Or do you see other good news in those announcements from any other countries? Дякую.
Дякую. Зараз Катерині передам. Я буквально нещодавно був в Південній Африці.
I've just been visiting South Africa, and I had representatives of South Africa coming to Ukraine a year ago. They were pro-Ukrainian. They were working with the mass media. And South Africa, they are very pro-Russian. The influence of Russian propaganda, they're incredible in South Africa. And it tells us only one thing. Today we need to tell the truth. Right now there are representatives of South Africa in Ukraine who, in cooperation with our Save Ukraine team, they go to the battle operations area. They come to our centers to talk to those children, to those families, to tell in South Africa what they've seen here, because what's told in their mass media is the manipulations and is Russian propaganda. Yes, regarding the compliance with the arrest orders, the statements by South Africa and other countries, and complications with fulfillment of those warrants, I want to emphasize that any country which is a part of the Rome Statute, if they state about the denouncement of the Rome Statute, it does not relieve them of the obligation to comply with this warrant, because it was issued during their membership. Still, ICC loses certain mechanisms of pressure, some leverage on those countries, but the ICC is not the only institution that can exercise some pressure. So talking about South African Republic, we keep in mind the agreements between them and European Union on protection of human rights, and it's European Union who, by the way of some trade mechanisms, may exercise pressure on South Africa to comply with that warrant. And the same story is with the other state. What's important is to accumulate the power of international community, and if some states will refuse to arrest Putin or Maria Lvova-Belova, they will be imposed sanctions on them. And this will demonstrate that it's not okay to do so, specifically if they are the member states of the International Criminal Court. And what I want to emphasize, that compliance with the arrest warrants, the ICC has such agreements with the countries which have not even ratified the Rome Statute. Unfortunately, the number and the names of those countries are not announced, but the ways of Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova to some countries, it's very complicated, and we see they are not ready to risk it. I'm being frequently asked by the journalists upon the award of the International Criminal Court in relation to Maria Lvova-Belova and Putin, has the situation changed with the return of the Ukrainian children? Is it easier? No, it's more difficult. Russia, they state that they ignore this warrant. They mock it. They don't pay attention to it. They say it's null and void, but we can evidence that they are afraid. So now it's way more difficult to bring children back, because every single child brought back to Ukraine is the witness of a war crime. They're afraid of it because it helps us create the cases for further awards, court awards for the further judgments in relation not only to Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, but in relation to other persons. So publicly they express that as if they mock this judgment, but in reality they are afraid of it, specifically those people who on different levels of power were exercising these criminal policies. So it really matters. It's a very important judgment. I want to thank you for this meeting. First of all, for the job done by our civil organizations on the way to bring our children back home. I want to thank Alina and Ms. Svitlana for your participation in this meeting. I hope that your input will help other families bring their children back to Ukraine. Thank you, dear journalists, for interest in this topic, and we continue working for our victory. We thank our armed forces for this opportunity to hold events like this. So glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.